So I've created this image in order to display how a line width will create a sense of depth in the image, and I'm going to go into value a little bit later, and also a little bit of composition. So in this image I've created trees in the foreground which have a thicker line, and these plants which have a particularly thick line, and then as things recede into the foreground the line gets thinner and thinner and thinner. It's not something you necessarily have to do for any line drawings, but if you're relying on line in order or if you're relying on line in the drawing, then it's a really useful way of doing it, because actually using the same width throughout can create this kind of quite flattened effect. But as I say, you don't have to do it, but there is something you have to consider. Is if I turn on this background tree here and I've made it sort of a thick line, if you don't control at least the line widths, and you make stuff in the background have thick lines, stuff in the foreground have thin lines, etc., etc., you're going to kind of run into this problem where by having something in the background which has the same width of line as those in the foreground, they then become existing on a common plane. They look like they're the same distance from the viewer, and it's kind of weird, especially if you've got similar shapes, and you can look at the Gestalt principles for this as well, where you've got things of similar shape, different size, which is indicating that this is further away, but then the line, which is the same throughout, then also then brings it forward. So it has this real feeling of being kind of misplaced, even though we know it's on the hill and it's sat on the bank in the distance. It has that feeling of coming forward. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important to keep an eye on the line thickness of things. And here I've just created thicker lines in the foreground and then gradually tailed them off to be nice and thin in the background. The other thing I've done is I've reduced the amount of detail from foreground to background. So I've got a plant here which has got leaves and it's got little flowers and petals, and as we go into the background you're not seeing any of that level of detail, and eventually when you get into the background, the far background with these trees, you're not seeing individual branches, you're sort of just seeing the general overall shape of the tree. If we weren't to do that, what that would do is it would create a lot of noise, because if you think about it, if you were to count the number of objects in the scene in terms of leaves, petals, etc., if you draw absolutely everything that's in here, you're going to create a huge amount of objects. Visually it's going to be really quite intense if you were to try and draw everything in, and also it would look very, very dark if you try to draw all the leaves in. So we've got the leaves in the foreground and petals because they're close to us, but as we move to the background that level of detail is dropping off until, like I say, we get back to the crowns of the trees and we're not really seeing individual branches or the smaller branches and the leaves, we're just seeing the general overall shape. And that way it's just, again, it's a lot easier to read. You don't have lots and lots of stuff that's competing for your attention. In terms of composition, what I've tried to do is just go into the rule of thirds. So if I go into view and show and show guides, I'm just using the rule of thirds here to try and lay things out, and I'm just going to put in the last couple of things, which is the rabbit here. If I can just select him, and also I think I've got a tree as well which I'll put in. Now what I can do is it's sort of trial and error, but often the rule of thirds will have these hot spots where the lines cross, which is a good place to place objects of significance, or just generally using the lines in order to break up the scene a little bit. So if I zoom out, and this is quite an important consideration when you're trying to put together a good composition, I'll turn these guides off. If I zoom out and if I pull back, and if I place the rabbit and I place him right in front of his front door, he's getting lost in there, and he's like a significant part of this scene, and I want him to be seen. So what I can do is use things like the rule of thirds to say place him on a kind of hot spot here so he's noticeable, but also doing things like breaking the line. So you've got the horizon line here and he breaks through it there. If I don't do that, if I put him in places where he's not breaking through lines, or he's in an area which is also already very busy, then he'll get lost. Whereas in this area here where there's not much going on, because of his amount of detail, then we pick him up much more, it's much easier to see him. So it's an important thing when you're looking at the hierarchy of the objects and the things that you're portraying in the scene, thinking about where you're placing them, the level of detail of the place that you're placing them, and also what they're intersecting with, what is it that's going to make them stand out. The other thing is also looking at the major shapes within the scene. If you imagine you just moved into a house and you're going to furnish your lounge or your living room, what you always do is you put in the large objects in first, and you put in your couch and you put in your big chairs, an armchair and TV table, etc., etc., because you don't want to put in all the small stuff and then have to rearrange it all, because also it allows you to think. You put in the big objects and then you can see generally where everything's going to go, and then you can put in the sort of smaller details, the ornaments and the books, etc., etc. And it's a little bit the same with drawing. It's really tempting to just blast in a load of shapes and then as soon as you can just go into loads and loads of detail. What you need to do is hang right back and just look at the scene itself, the major shapes within the scene, within the image, and start putting those in first, making sure that they balance okay, and then put in the detail afterwards, but only where it's needed. Working small like this is a really important consideration. Keep working small and don't zoom in too quickly, because one of the problems is if you start zooming in too quickly you'll get lost in the detail. So if I sort of zoom in really big here, I might go, oh well, this door and these windows, these really need some detail, and if I start working into these and adding loads and loads of detail because I think they should be detailed, because I've lost track of the overall composition, when I zoom out again, actually I'll have been working in a really small area adding loads of detail, and I won't have considered the bigger picture. And that's why it's really important just to make sure you work small, sort of pull right back so you can see the whole image, and then gradually move in and just add the detail really where you need it. One of the other things, the last thing I'm going to look at is value. And again, if I look at the values here, I've made everything relatively grey. I've added a bit of shine on some water here, but it has that flattening effect. And if we pull back and we look at the scene, everything looks rather flat. Now, especially with black and white scenes, and if I want to give a really good sense of mood, you need to play with the values in order to give a really good sense of depth. So I'll take these these front trees here. I'm going to make these darker because they're closer in, and this plant here, maybe just give it an 85% dark in there. The mid bank I'll probably put about 60. This background I'll leave as it is, and then these far trees I'll put at 30. So already there at this small scale, and remember it's about working small in order to see the bigger picture to start with, you can see that how the values are helping us see depth in the image just by doing that sort of simple process. And that just gives you a general overview of the way that line and depth, line and value can really give you a sense of depth. There is one last thing as well that you have to be very careful of, and that's when you're using line, making sure that lines are sufficiently dark. So if I pop in a gradient here, I'm just going to do a gradient across the whole image. If I then introduce a line to it, and I'll make the line a mid-grey, and I'll run it over the top of this gradient, what you're going to see is the mid-grey line is reacting, your vision is reacting and balancing to this gradient in the background. So as I put this mid-grey line in, it appears to be light when it's against a darker gradient, and it tends to get darker against the lighter and then sort of meld between the two. And this is purely because it's on a gradient. In fact, it's just flat grey, and if I put in black, you'll see it is just flat. So again, be careful when you're drawing line. If you're using a lighter colour for the line, there's different methods, usually trying to keep a darker version or darker colour of the fill is really important, or using black. But if you use a mid-tone like this, it's going to cause real problems with perception. It's going to look like it's rippling, so just be careful of that. But that pretty much sums it up.